Can the dead communicate with the living? Those who are bereaved sometimes long to make contact with those who have died. And there are those who deliberately prey upon grief and suffering, frauds and fakes who are only too eager to fleece those who have lost someone dear to them. Is Simon Purbeck a genuine medium or a fraud? Mrs. Mary Wells went to his seances for comfort, but now believes he is a fraud, and today he faces charges under the Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1951. It is alleged that he conducted seances with the intention to deceive Mrs. Mary Wells and received as a reward many thousands of pounds from her. Mrs. Wells is the first witness to be called at Fulchester Crown Court in the case of Regina versus Purbeck.
That the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Mrs. Mary Wells of Bysdale, the Ridge, Haley?
Yes.
When did your son die, Mrs. Wells?
4 years ago.
And what were the circumstances?
He and a friend were in a private plane. They crashed on landing.
And Brian was your only son?
Yes.
How old was he when he died?
22.
Have you no other children?
No, Brian was my only child.
You were very close?
Yes, we were.
You're a widow, Mrs. Wells?
Yes, my husband died about 10 years ago.
He left you well provided for?
Yes.
Would you describe yourself as a wealthy woman?
I don't know about wealthy. I'm fairly comfortably off, I suppose.
And when did you first turn, for consolation, to spiritualism?
About a year after Brian's death, when I recovered from my illness.
What illness was that, Mrs. Wells?
I had a nervous breakdown.
And after you recovered from this breakdown, you began to go to seances?
Yes.
With different mediums?
Yes.
And with what results?
Nothing that convinced me. Oh, I got messages, all sorts of things, but I never had the feeling that Brian was there. I knew he'd try and make contact if he could.
And when did you first go to Simon Purbeck?
Just over 2 years ago. I went along with a friend.
For a seance?
Yes, but he refused.
Mr. Purbeck refused to give you a seance?
Yes.
Did he give you any reasons for his refusal?
Well, he said he didn't like giving seances unless there was a real chance of success.
And did he indicate how these favourable circumstances might arise?
Well, he suggested I attended his lectures once a fortnight.
Did he actually say that if you attended these lectures, you would be successful in contacting your dead son?
Well, not exactly.
Well, what did he say exactly?
Well, he implied that the lectures were a kind of preparation.
For contacting the spirit world?
Yes.
Did he charge for these lectures?
Oh, yes.
How much?
£2 a time.
And were there any other charges?
Well, one was expected to make a contribution towards the publishing costs.
The publishing costs of what?
His books.
When you say you were expected to make a contribution, how did you learn this? Did someone tell you?
Well, no one actually told me, but I saw other people putting money in a plate, and I inquired.
And who did you ask?
Miss Marcus, Mr. Purbeck's secretary.
And what did she say?
Well, she said that some people who had found Mr. Purbeck's little talks helpful had suggested gathering them together and publishing them as a book.
For how long did you subsidize this publishing venture?
About 2 years.
Have you any idea how much you contributed towards the publishing costs?
Oh, it must have been £200 or £300. I don't know exactly.
And when did you receive your copy of Mr. Purbeck's book?
I didn't.
No book?
No.
Has anyone ever received a copy of Mr. Purbeck's book?
Your Honour, how can the witness possibly answer the question? She's in no position to know whether anyone ever received a copy of Mr. Purbeck's book.
Yes, I agree, Mr. Lotterby.
I will rephrase my question, Your Honour.
Do so, Mr. Dealey.
Mrs. Wells, to your knowledge, did anyone ever receive a copy of Mr. Purbeck's book?
No, as far as I know, it was never published.
Now, these lectures, what was to be their subject matter?
Well, spiritualism.
Spiritualism in general, or did Mr. Purbeck want to concentrate on specific aspects of the subject?
Well, mostly it was about how to contact one's loved ones on the other side.
And how was
The other side?
Passed over.
Jargon, Your Honour. I believe the witness means dead.
Ah, thank you, Mr. Dealey.
Mrs. Wells, how was this contact to be achieved?
Well, Mr. Purbeck said that everybody had it in them to be a medium. It was just a question of training oneself. It was as if one was a radio. One had to learn how to tune oneself in to the proper wavelength.
And were you successful?
Not at first.
So what did you do?
Well, I asked Miss Marcus if I could attend one of Mr. Purbeck's seances.
He held regular seances?
For some people, yes.
And what did Miss Marcos say?
Well, she said she would ask Mr. Purbeck if he thought I was ready.
And were you?
Well, I started going to the seances.
What form did these seances take?
Well, various forms.
Well, did Mr. Purbeck go into a trance?
Well, sometimes. And sometimes we'd use a glass. You know, everyone puts a finger on a glass and it spells out words from the letters of the alphabet which are arranged around the edge of the table.
Did you receive any messages purporting to come from your dead son?
Well, there were some, but at first they were very confused.
Did Mr. Purbeck tell you that they were from your son?
Yes.
He said that these confused messages were actually from your dead son, Brian.
Yes, but not exactly in those words.
Well, what did he say?
Well, he described the person who was trying to communicate. He described Brian.
Did he know at the time what Brian had looked like?
No, I don't know if he did. I had shown Miss Marcus a photograph of Brian some time before.
Did Mr. Purbeck explain why the messages were so confused?
Well, he said perhaps there was too much psychic interference, too many souls trying to get through.
Did he suggest a way of overcoming this?
No, but I asked Miss Marcus about it.
And what did she advise?
Well, she said that some people managed to persuade Mr. Purbeck to give them individual seances, that he found this very, very tiring, and he didn't like doing it, but sometimes he would.
And did she explain how they managed to persuade him?
No, but I presume they paid extra.
Did you pay that first time, Mrs. Wells?
No. Mr. Purbeck wouldn't accept any money.
Now, what happened at that first seance?
Well, Brian spoke to me.
But through Mr. Purbeck?
Yes. At least I thought it was Brian. No, I don't know.
And what did this voice say?
I'm here, Mum. And I felt him. He touched me. I'm sorry, Your Honor.
That's quite all right, Mrs. Wells. Take your time. Would you like to sit down while you're giving your evidence?
No, I'm quite all right, thank you. Thank you. I'd rather stand.
Has Mrs. Wells a glass of water?
Yes, I have, thank you. It's all right. I'd like to go on.
Very well.
Mrs. Wells, you said that somebody touched you.
Your Honour, may I correct my learned friend? The witness said he touched me, meaning, as I understand it, her son Brian.
I'm obliged, my learned friend. Mrs. Wells, you said that you felt a touch during that first seance.
Yes.
On your arm, your head?
No, on my shoulder, as if someone was standing behind me.
And was anyone standing there?
No.
Was the room in darkness?
Oh, not what you'd call darkness. The curtains were drawn.
So you couldn't see distinctly?
No.
Was there anyone else in the room besides you and the accused?
Well, Miss Marcos sat over by the door.
And did you watch Miss Marcos throughout the seance?
Oh, no, I watched Mr. Purbeck, of course.
Yes. Yes, of course. Mrs. Wells, what was your immediate reaction after you'd heard those words and felt that touch?
I don't know. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh.
You were deeply moved.
Yes.
Now, did you give Mr. Purbeck or Miss Marcos any money after that first seance?
Yes, I made a contribution towards the centre.
What centre?
Well, Mr. Purbeck wanted to open a centre for the study of spiritual sciences.
Did Mr. Purbeck ever explain these spiritual sciences, or indeed how they were to be studied?
Oh, yes, he explained, but I'm afraid I didn't understand.
How much did you contribute that first time?
£25.
And the same on each subsequent occasion?
No. Later I gave more, quite a bit more.
How much more?
Well, several times I gave £100, £200, £300.
In all, how much did you contribute in cash over the 2 years of the seances?
About £8,000, I suppose.
Money wasn't all you gave, was it, Mrs. Wells?
No. There was the house.
What house is this?
Oh, it's a house called the Pines in West Walsham. It was left to me by my uncle. Oh, it's far too big for me. Anyway, I have a house of my own.
And what is it worth at today's valuation?
Well, 30 to 35,000 pounds, I believe.
And you were induced to give this to Mr. Purbeck?
Your Honour, this really is outrageous. Counsel is leading the witness.
Yes. You will rephrase your question, Mr. Dealey?
As Your Honour pleases. Mrs. Wells, did you give this valuable property to Mr. Purbeck?
Yes.
To him personally?
No, to this trust he'd set up.
What trust?
Well, he set up a trust to run the centre.
Your Honour, I shall be calling a witness later on to give evidence regarding the nature of this trust. Now, Mrs. Wells, you have told us how your contributions towards Mr. Purbeck's various causes rose from £25 to hundreds of pounds and finally to a house worth tens of thousands of pounds. Why did your contributions increase?
Well, it's hard to explain exactly, but the more I gave, the more time Mr. Purbeck seemed able to give me. The more contact I had with Brian.
So, these alleged spirit communications seem dependent on the amount of money you gave.
Yes.
Now, how did you come to make the gift of the house?
Well, Brian seemed to want me to do it. I mean, the messages I were getting suggested I should donate something big, not just money.
And you took this to mean the house?
Well, what else could it mean? I asked Miss Marcus, and she said perhaps that was what Brian wanted.
What happened after you'd handed over the deeds of the house, Mrs. Wells? Was there a change in Mr. Purbeck's attitude?
Yes, he seemed to have less and less time for me. And when I did have the seances, well, it just didn't seem like Brian anymore.
Did you ever ask Mr. Purbeck for the return of your house?
Yes.
And what did he say?
He told me not to be a fool.
Do you now believe that these spirit communications were from your son, Brian?
Well, no. They couldn't have been, could they?
Thank you, Mrs. Wells.
Mrs. Wells, what were your feelings towards Mr. Purbeck?
Feelings?
Did you like him?
Well, yes.
Would you say you were fond of him?
Well,
Did you at any time indicate to anyone that you felt considerable affection for Mr. Purbeck?
I may have done. He reminded me of my son sometimes.
It's very understandable, Mrs. Wells. You felt maternal towards him?
Well, yes, I suppose so.
Mrs. Wells, you've said you were at one time convinced you were in communication with your dead son. What made you change your mind?
Well,
Did you talk it over with anyone, perhaps? Friends?
yes,
Anyone in particular?
Major Otway.
The Major, he was sceptical?
Yes,
Is the Major a relative?
he's my fiancé.
When did you become engaged?
About 4 months ago.
Did you know the Major during the time you went regularly to the seances?
No,
When did you meet him? Before or after you made the house over to the Trust?
or just after.
Mr. Lotterby, is this relevant? As I understand the position, you will shortly have every opportunity of questioning Major Otway in person.
Your Honour, I was merely seeking to establish that Major Otway has influenced Mrs. Wells just as much as it is claimed Mr. Purbeck ever did.
I follow your line of reasoning, Mr. Lotterby. I trust you will not be profligate with the court's time.
I shall endeavour to be brief, Your Honour. Mrs. Wells, you described that first séance with Mr. Purbeck, at which Miss Marcus was present. The séance at which you felt the presence of your son so strongly. Did you feel his presence on subsequent occasions?
Yes.
Was Miss Marcus present for all these occasions?
No,
Was anyone else present apart from Mr. Purbeck?
no. Major Otway a couple of times.
Until you discussed the séances with Major Otway, were you convinced that these communications with your dead son were genuine?
Well,
Please answer yes or no, Mrs. Wells.
yes, I suppose I was convinced.
And now you are totally and absolutely convinced beyond any shadow of doubt that these communications with your dead son were fraudulent?
Well, Oh, they must have been, mustn't they?
Mrs. Wells, did Mr. Purbeck or Miss Marcus ever ask you directly for payment?
Well...
Yes or no, Mrs. Wells?
No.
Did they ever at any time tell you that the communications with your dead son were dependent upon your financial contributions?
Well...
Yes or no, Mrs. Wells?
No.
Did they ever at any time ask you outright for the gift of your house?
No.
Thank you, Mrs. Wells.
I have no further questions, Your Honour.
You may stand down, Mrs. Wells. Thank you.
I should like to call Major Otway.
Major Otway.
What religion are you?
Church of England.
Take the testament in your right hand and read aloud the words on the card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Major Kenneth Otway, retired of 14B Tregarthen Court, Fulchester?
I am.
Major Otway, did you attend a number of seances with Mrs. Wells?
I did, sir.
Can you remember how many?
5 or 6.
And what was your opinion of them?
Pantomime, sir. I've never seen such pantomime of life.
Could you explain, please?
Well, darkened room, and Purbeck rolling around, moaning and groaning, and coming up with messages in different voices. I don't see how anyone could be taken in.
Mrs. Wells seems to have been.
Well, only for a bit. She's a sensible woman at heart.
You're not a believer in spiritualism, then, Major?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I'm a skeptic, I admit. But there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio.
Quite. So, we may take it that Mr. Purbeck did not impress you as a medium?
No, sir, I did not. The fake if ever I saw one.
Now, the defence has suggested that you have a great deal of influence over Mrs. Wells. Would you agree with that?
No. Oh, well, I suppose I have some influence. And if I do have any, it's a damn sight more healthy than Purbeck's.
Your Honour.
Confine yourself to answering the question, Major Otway.
I'm sorry, Your Honour.
And you will not use such language in my court.
Major, did you convince Mrs. Wells that she was victim of a fraud?
Well, she didn't take much convincing.
Did you persuade her to ask Mr. Purbeck for the return of her house?
Yes, I did.
Without success, it seems. Did you yourself see Mr. Purbeck personally about the matter?
Yes, and he's not an easy man to see.
What was his reaction?
Well, said he never had anything to do with business. Discoloured his aura or something.
Did you speak to Miss Marcos?
Yes, several times.
And what did she say?
Oh, long and short of it was none of my business. She refused to discuss anything concerning the centre with a non-believer.
Do you think she was acting on her own responsibilities, Major, or merely passing on the views of others?
Oh, I don't know. She's a hard woman, that one. I shouldn't have thought she was anyone's puppet. Still, you never know.
Who did you talk to in the end?
The solicitor in charge of the trust, Mr. Kimber, of Kimber, Craddock and Wake in Fulchester.
And what did he say?
Oh, a lot of legal mumbo-jumbo. Upshot of it all was no dice. They were going to hang on to that house, come what may.
Thank you, Major.
Major, you told us you attended several seances with Mrs. Wells.
Yes, sir.
Described them as pantomimes.
Correct?
By which you meant they were frauds, fakes.
Yes.
What did these seances consist of?
Oh, trances, table rapping, pushing a glass around a lot of letters, spelling out words, or the usual nonsense.
How many times did you see Mr. Purbeck in a trance?
Twice.
What happened at the other seances?
He used the glass.
Did you catch Mr. Purbeck guiding the glass himself?
Well, no.
Did you, in fact, catch Mr. Purbeck faking any of the phenomena that occurred at these seances?
No, but...
Was Miss Marcus ever present at these seances?
No.
Was anyone else ever present?
No.
In fact, have you any concrete evidence that Mr. Purbeck faked anything?
Well, I don't have a piece of cheesecloth, if that's what you mean. But I've no doubt if I'd have looked...
But you did not look, Major Otway. So you have no concrete evidence that Mr. Purbeck faked anything? Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour. So, Major, in spite of having no evidence, you took it upon yourself to persuade Mrs. Wells that Mr. Purbeck was a fake.
Well, it was obvious.
Apparently not to Mrs. Wells. She appears to have derived considerable consolation from her communications with the spirit world until you came into her life. Where exactly did you come from?
What do you mean?
You retired from the army, I believe.
Correct?
You live on an army pension?
Yes, sir.
Do you have any other source of income?
I have a job.
Oh, yes. Secretary to a tennis and social club.
Yes. Well, of course, it isn't much. Just about keeps me in cigarettes, you know, but one must keep busy.
Will you continue with the job after you marry Mrs. Wells?
Your Honour, I fail to see how the marriage plans of the witness can possibly affect the issue before this court.
Nevertheless, the witness will answer the question.
Well, if you want to know about my job, I shall be giving it up shortly.
And what will you do then?
Well, Mary, Mrs. Wells, has asked me to help straighten out her financial affairs. They're in a bit of a mess, as you can imagine.
Oh, you're an expert on financial matters, are you?
Oh, no, I wouldn't say that exactly.
A keen amateur?
Yes, yes. Yes, I rather like that, yes.
Where did you gain this amateur experience? At the tennis club?
Well, I have friends in the city.
So you have no personal experience of handling complex financial matters?
Well, I pick things up pretty quickly.
Mrs. Wells will pay you for this amateur financial advice?
Yes.
Her idea?
Well, yes.
More than you're getting from the tennis club?
Yes.
What was it you described Mr. Purbeck as? Oh, yes. A fraud and a fake?
Now, look here, I don't know what you're implying, but I'm damned if I'm going to stand here and allow you... I'm sorry, Your Honour.
Major, when you attended these seances, you did so as Mrs. Wells' guest?
Yes.
And did Mrs. Wells ever ask you to keep an eye on Mr. Purbeck?
No. No. She thought he was marvellous. I didn't. Then, of course, I couldn't go dashing around accusing him of being a fake, could I? Just had to sit there through all that phony nonsense and grin and bear it for our sake.
Thank you, Major Otway.
You may stand down, Major Otway.
Your Honour, I would like to call Mr. Walter Kimber, who is the solicitor for the accused.
Walter Kimber. Mr. Dealey, do I understand you correctly? You're calling Mr. Purbeck's own solicitor?
Yes, Your Honour.
Has Mr. Kimber been served with a subpoena?
No, Your Honour.
Your Honour, might I be permitted to explain?
I should be grateful if someone would, Mr. Lotterby.
Mr. Kimber handled all the legal matters connected with the setting up of the trust for the proposed study centre and for the transfer of the house. As my client, Mr. Purbeck, is anxious to show he has nothing to fear from the truth, he's willing to waive his right to silence on the part of his solicitor.
Mr. Lotterby, is your client aware of the possible consequences of this action?
I have endeavoured to explain them to him, Your Honour.
Mr. Purbeck is waiving one of the fundamental rights which exist between a client and his lawyer. Secrecy. Mr. Purbeck, are you fully aware of the possible consequences of this action? By waiving your rights over your own solicitor, you expose both yourself and him. I suggest that you consider this course of action very, very carefully.
I want Mr. Kimber to give evidence for the prosecution. I have nothing to fear from the truth.
The case of the Queen versus Purbeck will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.